Hægl befwittast krona, skärft hit on heavenest liefde, wheelcalf hit winde köle, whalethef hit to waterla sithan.
Ela, Wezef Hala und Beof Willkommen. Welcome back to part 2 of this episode about the Anglo-Saxon rune Hægl. Now before I get started, I would just like to thank my subscribers. I really do appreciate your support. And in Old English, ich bitte eau underlied. Willa je jean lachen. Minus theod maienes, ich thank je eau, je sind sweefer mildelich. I would really appreciate if you could like this video, if you could share it. I'm on a one-woman mission to show people how interesting, how rich and magical the Anglo-Saxon culture was. And yeah, just, you know, share this out there so that we can show people that the Anglo-Saxons were every bit as cool, if not cooler, than their Scandinavian cousins, the Vikings. I also have a Patreon, and I would of course appreciate your support on that. And also if you wanted to buy me a coffee, that again would be greatly appreciated. So, in part 1 of this video, I talked about hail and how this weather phenomena could affect the lives of the Anglo-Saxons. But what about if things got worse? I mean, like really, really bad. Well, this is what happened during the 6th century, when something happened which rocked significant parts of the world and caused disaster which some people believe had far-reaching and long-lasting consequences. Some people believe that AD 536 was the worst year to be alive, for in that year an atmospheric acidic dust cloud caused the sun to darken and the temperatures to drop in the northern hemisphere, which then went on to result in famine, plague, pestilence, and then war, and quite possibly ushered in the end of the old world and brought in the beginning of the new. Now, various theories have been proposed which say that this atmospheric event resulted in massive changes in the demographic of Britain and actually led to the conquest of the West by the Anglo-Saxons. But that, my friends, is a story for another day. Now, these events, the darkening of the sun being blocked out and going dark, which then resulted in famine and plague, well, it does all rather sound very Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, doesn't it? So what actually happened? Well, we can do our best to piece the evidence together. We can use both contemporary evidence that was written down at the time, plus we can use later scientific evidence. So let's start, shall we, with the literary evidence. Now, there are in fact several contemporary accounts which come from the Mediterranean about this event, including one by Procopius, who I've spoken about before, a Greek scholar and the principal Roman historian. And at the time that he wrote this, he was located in both Italy and Africa. Now, this is what Procopius wrote. And it came about during this year that a most dread portent took place, for the sun gave forth its light without brightness. like the moon during this whole year, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse, for the beams it shed were not clear nor such as it is accustomed to shed. And from the time when this thing happened, men were free neither from war nor pestilence, nor any other thing leading to death. And it was the time when Justinian was in the 10th year of his reign, which dates that to 536-537 time. Now this is not the only contemporary account from the Mediterranean, there were others, and the next quote that I'm going to read you comes from Michael the Syrian. Now he was actually a 12th century bishop, but it's extremely likely that he was copying earlier work from the writings of John of Ephesus, who was a 6th century ecclesiastical historian. Now he tells us, in the year 848, so that actually relates to 536-537 CE, there was a sign in the sun, the like of which had never been seen and reported before in the world. If we had not found it recorded in the majority of proved and credible writings, and confirmed by trustworthy people, we would not have recorded it, for it is difficult to conceive. So it is said that the sun became dark, and its darkness lasted for 1.5 years, that is 18 months. Each day it shone for about 4 hours, and still this light was only a feeble shadow. Everyone declared that the sun would never recover its original light. The fruit did not ripen, and the wine tasted like sour grapes. I don't know if it's even possible for us to imagine how it would feel if that happened to us during our lifetime. The impact of it must have been absolutely huge to anyone who was alive at that time and experiencing that event. Now in the autumn of 536, Cassiodorus, who was a Praetorian prefect of Italy, he described the effects of this phenomena in a letter which he wrote to his deputy Ambrosius. How strange it is, I ask you, to see the principal star, and not its usual brightness, to gaze on the moon, glory of the night, at its full, but shorn of its natural splendour. All of us still observing, as it were, a blue-coloured sun, we marvel at bodies that cast no midday shadow, and at that strength of intensest heat reaching extreme and dull tepidity. And this has not happened in the momentary loss of an eclipse, but has assuredly been going on equally through almost the entire year. How fearful it is then to endure for so long what will terrify a people, even when it passes quickly. And I think when we think about that, you know, this event lasted for 18 months. That is a long, long time to be in a state where you are fearful that something absolutely terrible has happened and are suffering the effects of that terrible event. So from those literary accounts, we know that this event was most definitely happening in the Mediterranean. But are there any literary accounts to tell us that this event was also being experienced in Britain by the Anglo-Saxons that were living here? So let's start where we usually do and have a look at the work of Bede, or as I call him, Beda, because that's probably how his name was pronounced, but the Venerable Bede, because of course he was writing things down, and in his work he covered the chronological period from around 60 BCE until 731 Common Era. Now he wasn't actually born until around 673, meaning that he arrived on the scene as a sweet little baby, presumably, around 137 years after this dramatic and devastating event had occurred. This means that much of his material for the period before he was alive was obtained from the historical records which were available to him. Now, during the time period which was covered by Bede, there were a total of 13 eclipses of the sun which would have actually been visible from Britain. Now, in addition to that, there were 28 more which would have been visible from Italy and the Eastern Mediterranean. However, what is curious is that in the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, written by Bede, he briefly mentions only 3 of those eclipses. Now, what's also curious and interesting is that he completely omits to mention several eclipses which would have been clearly visible from his home in Jarrow, and at least 2 of the ones that he did mention would barely have been visible from the shores of Britain. Now, the other rather interesting thing about these 2 is that they both occur extremely close to the date in which the sun darkened, the crops failed, the temperatures dropped in 536. Now, the eclipses which Bede does mention happened in 538 and 540. So what does Bede's reference to these 2 solar eclipses that happened so close to this event tell us? Well, the fact that he only wrote about 2 of those eclipses when there had been so many others would suggest that he did know about this event that darkened the skies, and it may be that he wrongly assumed that the reason for this event was eclipses. So we know that Bede was not writing at the time of the event. We know that he wasn't even born at the time of the event. So was there actually anybody else who was living on these shores that was writing things down at the time? Well, yes, there is one person that I am aware of. He, in fact, was not an Anglo-Saxon. He was someone who actually detested the Anglo-Saxons with quite a fiery passion. He didn't even want to utter their names. That was the level of his contempt for them. Now, his name was Gildas, and he was a British monk who was actually alive at the time of the darkening of the skies in 536. Now, he lived in southwest Britain, where I am at the moment, and his record is the only contemporary record of the text that I am aware of. Now, he actually died in 570 in Brittany. Now, his work, which was called De Excidio et Conquestu Britanniae, I think I pronounced that right. I didn't do Latin at school, I did German instead, which is concerning the ruin of Britain. It was a scathing 3-part sermon that he used to attack the actions of his contemporaries, both secular and religious. Now, he wrote this work in around the year 540, so roughly 4 years after this darkening of the skies occurred. Now, it's interesting because in his sermon he wrote these words: "Which of them can fulfill this even for a single day? Rather does a dense cloud and black night of their sins so loom over the whole island that it diverts almost all men from the straight way and makes them stray along the trackless and entangled paths of crime. And by their works the Heavenly Father is intolerably blasphemed rather than praised." Now, the imagery which he has chosen to use in his sermon is also rather strikingly specific in the way that he mentions the dense cloud and the black night which loom over the whole island. Yes, I know that this is now starting to sound a little bit like a Deep Purple song, But interestingly, in his work, the comparisons which he draws between light and dark are noticeable and prominent. Now, he uses this imagery, this contrast between the dark and the light, several times throughout his sermon. Now, the other thing which is interesting about the work of Gildas is that he mentions that the thoughts which he put into this sermon had been on his mind for around 10 years, but that he'd only chosen to commit them to writing at that point. Now, one might wonder why, having pondered this sermon for 10 years, what actually prompted him to actually write it down and put it out there so many years after he'd first thought about it. You know, a decade is, after all, a fairly significant period of time in a human's life, although I must admit that it does go scarily quickly. But, you know, could it have been the circumstances caused by the dark cloud, you know, the blocking out, the darkening of the sun, which gave him the prompt, you know, that he needed to actually create what had been on his mind? We have to assume that the people living at the time must have taken this event to be a very dread portent. It must have been terribly scary. You know, they must have thought that Judgment Day was coming. You know, the Christian people living in this country must have thought that Judgment Day was indeed coming. And why wouldn't they? For if we look at the Bible, we can see in St. Mark chapter 13 verse 24 these words: "But in those days after that tribulation, the sun shall be darkened and the moon shall not give her light." And that is exactly what was happening in the years 536 to 537. Again, if we look at the Bible in the New Testament, St. Luke chapter 21 verse 25, we find, "And there shall be signs in the sun and in the moon and in the stars, and upon the earth distress of nations with perplexity, the sea and the waves roaring." So it's quite likely that Gildas was driven to release this sermon because he very well could have believed that he was running out of time to do so, and that the day of reckoning was fast approaching. Indeed, what happened in the 6th century is pretty much the same as what would happen in the terrible event of a nuclear winter. The sun, it dimmed for more than a year. The winter never really ended. There was frost and snow in the middle of the summer. So we've looked at the literary evidence which is available to us. Now let's turn our attention to the scientific evidence to see if we can find out what actually happened in that dread year. So there are two main pieces of scientific evidence which help to tell us what actually happened in that year. Now, the first is tree ring evidence and the second is ice core evidence. Let's start with the trees, shall we? Because I love trees and trees never really lie. So the tree ring evidence shows us that in 536, tree growth in England slowed considerably, and it didn't actually recover until the year 555. That's quite a long time. So if the trees were suffering, we can be sure that the crops were as well, and that the people were also. Now, in addition to that, an analysis of the weather between 480 and 650 confirms that the period between the years 535 and 555 was a period of abnormally unstable freak weather conditions. So what actually happened? Now, climate scientists are agreed that this period, which is commonly known or referred to as the Late Antique Little Ice Age, and which lasted from 536 until 560, was probably the result of a series of volcanic eruptions which happened in around 536, 540 and 547. So back in the 1970s, a team of scientists started sampling ice cores in Greenland and in the Antarctic. Now, interestingly, these ice cores provide a very consistent indication that the 536 dust veil was most likely caused by a huge volcanic eruption. Now, there is a difference of opinions in the scientific community as to where these volcanic eruptions, which sent the northern hemisphere into absolute turmoil, where they actually occurred. Now, some scholars believe that the volcano was in Iceland, and others believe that it was located in Japan. Others believe that it was located in the tropics of Indonesia. Now, I think what we can say is that wherever the culprit was located, you know, this volcanic eruption must have been absolutely huge. You know, it pumped out vast quantities of volcanic ash into the atmosphere, you know, which blocked out Suna for 18 months. You know, the summer temperatures dropped by 1.5 to 2.5 degrees centigrade, and between 536 and 545, the coldest decade on record for 2,000 years, caused crop failure from Ireland across to China. Interesting that, as I've mentioned, Suna, she has in fact come out, and interestingly, it is actually the spring equinox today. I didn't plan to record this video on the equinox, it just so happened to be that way. So it's believed that in 541 there was a second volcanic eruption which saw summer temperatures in Europe drop again by 2.7 degrees centigrade, which further compounded the issues that were happening. And then again a further volcanic eruption is thought to have happened in 547, which again further complicated this terrible situation. So I want you to imagine that you are an Anglo-Saxon living in England in 536. You're a heathen. This is several years before Augustine came to the shores of Kent to begin the Christian conversion period. So you are a heathen Anglo-Saxon living in this country when this dramatic event happens. Your entire life has been so closely linked with the seasons of nature. You are intrinsically linked with them. You understand them. You work with them. It is through working with nature that you are able to feed yourself and your family. Then something happens. The sun, the life bringer, the thing that helps the crops to grow and keeps you alive, it becomes dim and dark. A dark fog hangs over your world. It doesn't go away. The temperatures drop, the crops suffer, the animals suffer, you suffer. What would you think? What would you feel? What would you think was happening? Now, we can suspect from what we've discovered about Gildas and the Christians who were living in Britain at the time, who must have thought that Judgment Day was approaching. Did the heathen Anglo-Saxons also living in Britain, did they suspect that Ragnarok was coming? Now, Ragnarok is the great Norse myth which tells of the end of the current world. A great battle ensues which results in the death of several major gods. in their fight against the giants of chaos. Shall we have a look at the Ragnarok story? I think we should. Let's have a look.
Beyond Wolf, I've heard many of your stories, but tell me, what is Ragnarok? I've heard mention of it several times, but so far, no one has explained its meaning to me.
Let's show this ignorant Frisian what Ragnarok is. Imagine, if you can, 3 long years of winters. No sun will shine its warmth upon the world. 3 years of cataclysmic winters. Fearsome winds blasting the landscape with snow and ice. Thunder and lightning will force the world to cower and beg for mercy at its mighty force. Thunder loud enough to deafen a soul and smash a man's bones to splinters. Lightning so bright and intense as to blind all who are foolhardy enough to gaze upon it. All hope will be expunged from our very souls. Friend will wage war against friend. Brother will fight brother. Lover will fight lover. Axe age, sword age, shields will be cleft asunder. An age of wind will endure and pass into an age of the wolf. As the world begins its headlong plunge into oblivion, no man will spare another. Gjallarhorn is blown, its mournful notes echoing a sorrowful warning across the land, blown by Hægl, the watchman of the gods and guardian of the Bifrost Bridge. Jormungandr awakens from his perpetual slumber on the ocean floor. He heaves his mighty bulk towards the land and drags his fearsome bloated body up the beach. Bringing with him the tides, he floods the chaotic world, covering it in crashing creamy crested waves, drowning all and sundry. Naglfar breaks free of its moorings and sails across the turbulent, seething mountainous waters to Vigrior, with Loki at its helm, carrying its cargo of monstrous passengers destined to battle with the mighty gods. The giant fearsome wolf Fenrir breaks the magical chains that bind him in captivity. Free now, he is eager for the fray. And from the flaming world of Muspelheim, in the south comes the Lord Surt. Odin rides from Valhall. His faithful warriors at his side, he fights a fierce fight with the mighty Fenrir, who after an epic battle defeats Odin, slays him in what turns out to be his final fight. Odin's son Vidar avenges his father's honour by besting the mighty Fenrir in a fight to end all fights. They battle with awesome aggression, with fearsome wounds to both until Fenrir lays dead at Vidar's feet. Garm, the wolf guardian of the realm of the dead, battles the great god Tyr. After breaking free of his fetters, they fight a fierce battle, and in the end both succumb to their wounds and die. Heimdall does battle with Loki. Finally, after a vicious, lengthy fight, Heimdall is victorious but is grievously wounded. The god Frey encounters the giant Surt. After a long, bloodthirsty battle, they too will both succumb to their monstrous wounds and die. Thunor, oh great Thunor, fights the final battle with the giant world serpent Jormungandr. Thunor claims victory over the vile serpent, but in a cruel twist of fate, later dies from the beast's venom.
Now, of course, as I have said many times before, our literary evidence for the pre-Christian conversion heathen faith of the Anglo-Saxons is extremely limited and extremely poor. Therefore, there is no direct evidence that the Anglo-Saxons did know about and believe in the Ragnarok story. I could never prove that, but it is my belief that they did, and that is what they would have thought was happening. So let's look at my reasons for why I think they would have known about this story. Now, we know that the Anglo-Saxons believed in and worshipped Woden and Futhorc, who are the Anglo-Saxon equivalents of the Norse Odin and Thor. Now, these two gods, as we've seen, were very major players in the Ragnarok story. Now, we also know that the Anglo-Saxons believed in giants. And we also know, as I've spoken about previously, that they did differentiate between positive giants, which they called heathens, the smiths, as in Wayland's smithy, the builders and the master craftsmen, and the destructive giants, which they called Thursa.
Stana, that Crowan.
Oi! I ain't having that. I'm sorry, Sherry, but I just want to point out that Thursa is in fact the genitive plural of the noun thurs. Anyway, back to the video. Ichwila Dlinken Mina Bayor. Fare well. Now, I've mentioned before that we can glean a little into the Anglo-Saxons' beliefs and attitudes towards these Thursa from their poetry. If we look to the Exeter Book of Riddles, I can dine more mightily and eat as much as an old thurs. I'm sorry, there appears to be a dragon going over. Shall we wait for it to go? They're noisy beggars. Dragons. That dragon sure is taking its time. Okay, I think it's gone. So if we look at Maxims 2 in the Exeter book, Thurs shall on fenna Yubunian, Anna inan landa. A thirst must dwell in the fen, alone in the land. So I see absolutely no reason why the heathen Anglo-Saxons at the time would not have had a knowledge of the Ragnarok story. And I also see no reason at all as to why the 536 dust cloud, which blotted out the sun for a long period of 18 months, would not have made them believe that Ragnarok was coming. Now, we can find stories of Ragnarok in the Poetic Edda and the Völuspá, and interestingly they use very similar language to which we found in the Bible, mentions of the sun darkening, which of course is exactly what did happen in 536. Völuspá 40, it gluts itself on doomed men's lives, reddens the god's dwelling with crimson blood, sunshine becomes black all the next summers, weather all vicious. Do you want to know more, and what? And Völuspá 54, the sun turns black, land sinks into the sea, the bright stars vanish from the sky, steam rises up in conflagration, hot flame plays against bright heaven itself. And they were translations by Carolyn Larrington. So I think, as in the same way that we can imagine the Christian Britons were panicked by this event, we can probably also assume that the Anglo-Saxon heathens living in England at the time may well have also been similarly, I can't say that word, panicked, but with the thought that it was Ragnarok that was approaching. Now, I'm a person living in the 21st century. I have the knowledge of science, of people cleverer in such things than me explaining to me what's happening. But I have to say, if the sun went dark for 18 months, I would be seriously freaking out of my noggin. And that is me as a 21st century person. Oh God, that bloody dragon's back. But so I can only imagine that to an Anglo-Saxon living in this country at the time, you know, with their heads full of giants and gods and, you know, thursers and things that dwell in the fens, I can only imagine, with their crops failing, with their tummies being hungry, that they would have been seriously panicked about the end of the days. Now, some of the scenes from the Ragnarok story are actually depicted on a large Anglo-Saxon cross, which is located in St Mary's Churchyard in Gosforth in Cumbria. Now, I would love to see this, and I think it is definitely going to have to feature in a future Anglo-Saxon road trip, because it is 15 feet tall, very imposing, carved of red sandstone, and it's believed to date from the first half of the 10th century. Now, of course, it could have been built by Vikings, Norse people that had settled here, but we don't know who built it, do we? The carvers could have been Anglo-Saxons, we don't know. But this imposing cross, it depicts various scenes from the Völuspá poem. So let's have a look, shall we, at some of the images on the Gosforth Cross. Now, I've been doing some artwork, so yeah, I've got some of those images here. And this first one we can see shows a depiction of Loki bound with his wife Sigyn, trying to catch the venom that's dripping from the serpent's mouth onto Loki's head. And we can see this depiction. Now, this shows Odin's son Vidar, who is fighting the mighty wolf Fenrir. Oh, goodness me, it's noisy here today. And this depiction here shows the watchman god, the protector of the Bifrost Bridge, Heimdall, with his horn, Gjallarhorn. So these depictions of the Völuspá poem are sitting side by side with Christian images on this cross up in Cumbria. So, I have gone on for long enough. I do hope that you have enjoyed this little look at what some contemporary scientists believe was the worst year to be alive, and an event which I believe could have made the Anglo-Saxons believe that the end of the world was nigh and that Ragnarok was coming. A time where brother will fight brother and become his slayer, an axe age, a sword age, a time when shields were cleft asunder. So, thank you all for watching. I do appreciate it, and if you haven't already subscribed, please do so. It's lovely to hear your comments, and I really do appreciate them. So join me, if you will, in the next part of this episode, where I am going to be searching for the mighty Futhorc. So, all I have left to say today is Fala Fiasunda Woden Sea Mid Eal.